Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Welcome in, everyone. If you are an advanced practice nursing or nurse practitioner student, you are exactly where you need to be today.
Absolutely. We've got a really critical one for you.
Yeah, because our mission for this deep dive is to serve as your one-on-one tutoring session for Chapter 76, which is toxic and environmental exposures. And this isn't just a dry textbook lecture. This is real-world clinical detective work.
Right, but think about it. Up to 65,000 times a year in the U.S., someone comes into the ED or the clinic with no diagnostic clues, no positive culture, no x-ray showing a fracture.
Just their vital signs, maybe altered pupillary reflexes or like profound diaphoresis.
Exactly. You get the pathophysiology playing out in real time.
Yeah.
And the epidemiological divide in those 65,000 annual deaths really dictates your index of suspicion.
How so? Like by age?
Yeah, exactly. So in pediatric populations, kids under 5, we are almost exclusively managing accidental ingestions, curiosity meeting an unlocked medicine cabinet. But when we assess adolescents and adults, the clinical picture shifts dramatically. It's suddenly intentional ingestions, self-harm, recreational polysubstance abuse.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we're dealing with patients who often either can't or just won't tell us what they took. So your entire assessment really hinges on understanding dose-dependent physiological responses.
It does. And carbon monoxide poisoning is, it's a stark example of this.
Yeah, like when a patient inhales motor vehicle exhaust or smoke from a faulty furnace, the CA doesn't just passively push oxygen out of the way.
No, it actively hijacks the whole transport system. Because hemoglobin has roughly a 200 times greater affinity for carbon monoxide than for oxygen.
200 times? That's wow.
Right. It forms carboxyhemoglobin, which is just disastrous for cellular respiration. And it's not just taking up the binding sites. It physically alters the hemoglobin molecule shape.
Which causes that leftward shift in the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, right?
Exactly. So the hemoglobin tightly grips whatever residual oxygen it still has and just refuses to offload it to the tissues. Systemic hypoxia ensues.
And the scary part is early presentations are so vague. Like severe toxicity gives you the deep respirations and that classic cherry red skin, but early on.
Yeah, early on. They might walk into your primary care clinic with just a headache and mild nausea.
Which, missing that subtle presentation could be fatal.
Completely fatal.
So we see a similar mechanistic threat with CNS depressants, right? Especially when we look at the difference between barbiturates and benzodiazepines.
Yes. They both act on the inhibitory GABA receptors, but their mechanism at the cellular level is what dictates the toxicity.
Right. So I like to use an analogy here. If we look at the GABA chloride ion channel as a doorway that calms the central nervous system down.
Okay, I like that.
Then benzodiazepines just increase how often that door opens, like the frequency. But barbiturates prop the door wide open for a long duration. Doesn't that make barbiturates inherently more dangerous? Because there's no cap on how much depressant activity happens.
Yes, that is exactly why they are so dangerous. Because that duration leaves the chloride channel propped wide open, it facilitates this massive, unchecked influx of chloride ions,
causing profound hyperpolarization.
Right. Benzos have a natural sealing effect. There's a limit to how fast the door can open and close. But barbiturates completely bypass that sealing. They lack those saturable, safer kinetics.
Which leads directly to suppressed sympathetic tone, severe respiratory depression, and just direct inhibition of the heart.
Exactly. And when a patient is unresponsive, you map these receptor-level changes through the physical exam using toxidromes.
Right, from table 76.1 and 76.2 in the text, which are essential for your diagnostic shortcut.
Yes, the 5 main toxidromes.
Yeah.
Sympathomimetic, anticholinergic, cholinergic, sedative, hypnotic, and opioid.
Let's talk about the two that frequently mimic each other, sympathomimetic and anticholinergic, because both give you profound tachycardia, massive pupils, hyperthermia, and high BP.
But the skin and the bowel sounds tell the real story.
Right, sweaty versus dry.
Yep. So the sympathomimetic patient, say they're intoxicated on cocaine or amphetamines, they're having a massive catecholamine release. So they'll be flushed, heavily diaphoretic, and their bowel sounds will be hyperactive.
But the anticholinergic patient, maybe overdosing on a PCA or diphenhydramine, they have competitive antagonism at the muscarinic receptors. So they're flushed but completely dry.
Like a bone, incapable of sweating. plus absent bowel sounds and urinary retention because that parasympathetic smooth muscle contraction is blocked.
Got it. And then on the opposite side, we have the cholinergic toxidrome, which is an excess of acetylcholine, usually from organophosphates.
Right. This is your classic SLUG-G mnemonic.
Salivation, lacrimation, urination, diarrhea, GI distress, and emesis. Just fluid leaking everywhere.
Parasympathetic overdrive, along with dangerous bradycardia. But look, while identifying these toxidromes is crucial, your priority setting has to remain rigid.
ABCs first. Airway, breathing, circulation. Never bypass those to chase an antidote.
Never. And concurrently, you must get a 12-lead ECG. That's a non-negotiable diagnostic step.
Because toxins like tricyclic antidepressants, TCAs, actively block the fast sodium channels in the heart's His-Purkinje system.
Right, which manifests as a widened QRS complex and a dangerously prolonged QTC interval. That predisposes them to fatal ventricular arrhythmias.
And you're not going to catch a sodium channel blockade on a physical exam. And you definitely can't sit around waiting for a urine tox screen.
Oh, please don't wait for a tox screen. They are highly limited in acute crises. A urine tox screen only proves that an exposure occurred in the recent past.
It gives you zero quantitative data about the current serum level.
Right. It doesn't prove the substance detected is actually what's causing the patient's current hemodynamic instability.
Okay, so let's shift to GI decontamination. Because the standard of care has totally changed. I mean, we used to tell parents to keep a bottle of syrup of Ipecac under the sink.
Oh, yeah. But the American Academy of Pediatrics abandoned that back in 2003. Its efficacy was just too unpredictable, and the aspiration risks were severe.
So what's the pivot? Activated charcoal.
Activated charcoal. It works via adsorption. Not absorption with a B, but adsorption with a D. The highly porous lattice uses van der Waals forces to bind xenobiotic molecules in the GI tract.
So it traps them before they can enter the systemic circulation.
Exactly. But it's highly time-dependent. The optimal window is within 1 hour of ingestion, and it's useless for heavy metals, toxic alcohols, caustics, and cyanide.
Because they just don't bind to that carbon lattice.
Right. As for dosing, it's 1 gram per kilogram for adults and 1 to 2 grams per kilogram for kids.
But we need to highlight a huge safety warning here. Some formulations include sorbitol as a cathartic to, speed up the bowel transit time.
Yes. Do not use that in pediatric populations. Sorbitol creates a massive osmotic pull, drawing fluid into the bowel lumen. In young kids, that rapid fluid shift triggers profound dehydration and severe electrolyte derangements. It's a major safety hazard.
Okay, noted. Now, what about illicit substance transport? Because I'm assuming charcoal isn't going to fix that.
No, GI decontamination requires a completely different approach there. We use whole bowel irrigation with a polyethylene glycol electrolyte solution, or PIG-LS.
Right, and this brings up the difference between body packers and body stuffers, which is such a crazy distinction, like professional shipping versus just shoving things in a grocery bag.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because a body packer is a professional. They've swallowed heavily compressed, machine-sealed latex or polyurethane. They're actually pretty stable unless a package ruptures.
Right. But a body stuffer is usually someone frantically swallowing baggies or single layers of cellophane to avoid the police.
And the gastric acid just eats right through that makeshift packaging.
Instantly, threatening a massive bolus release of the drug directly into the highly absorptive small intestine, which is an absolute clinical emergency.
So we use whole bowel irrigation to essentially flush them out.
Yes. High volumes of PEG-ELS, up to 2 liters an hour for an adult, just mechanically flushing the GI tract to the rectal effluent is completely clear.
Wow. Okay, let's look at one more poisoning scenario. An undifferentiated patient, depressed mentation, respiratory depression, and we have zero collateral history.
That's when we immediately initiate the coma cocktail safety protocol.
Right. Which targets the rapidly reversible causes. So IV dextrose for masked hypoglycemia and 100 milligrams of IV thiamine.
Specifically for Wernicke encephalopathy, yes. Especially if they have a history of chronic alcohol use or malnutrition.
And then naloxone. But the text notes that with synthetic opioids being so potent now, we have to push those doses way up. Right?
Oh, absolutely. The standard algorithms aren't always enough. You might need up to 5 to 10 milligrams to reverse that mu-opioid receptor blockade and get their respiratory drive back.
That's terrifying. Okay, so we've seen how exogenous chemicals just overwhelm the body's internal receptors. But what happens when the environment itself overwhelms our ability to maintain homeostasis? Let's transition to heat-related illnesses.
It's all about the physics of heat loss. radiation, convection, conduction, and evaporation.
Right. But there is a firm physiological threshold. Once the ambient environment hits 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius, radiation and conduction do nothing.
Nothing at all. Evaporation, meaning sweating, becomes the absolute only mechanism left to cool the body.
Which makes acclimatization kind of a genius evolutionary adaptation, right?
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
Because an unacclimatized person will lose about 30 to 50 milliequivalents of sodium per liter of sweat.
That's a huge electrolyte loss.
Huge. But over a week or two in high heat, the body upregulates aldosterone. So an acclimatized person can sweat up to 3 liters an hour to cool down while dropping their sodium loss to just 5 milliequivalents per liter.
That is amazing. But it also means if a patient is taking an anticholinergic drug, they are basically chemically disabling their only cooling system.
Precisely. They can't sweat. And it's not just them. Patients on beta blockers can't mount the compensatory tachycardia needed to circulate blood to their skin.
Oh, right. In patients with advanced diabetes.
Autonomic neuropathy. They lack the neural signaling to trigger adequate sweating. Along with age extremes, these are your highest risk populations.
So let's look at table 76.3, the heat illness continuum. It starts with heat rash, which is trapped sweat, then heat cramps from muscle fatigue and electrolyte depletion.
And then heat syncope, where massive peripheral vasodilation for cooling causes sudden orthostatic cooling of the blood.
Right, which drops cerebral perfusion so they pass out. But the critical distinction for students is the line between heat exhaustion and heat stroke.
That line saves lives. Heat exhaustion involves intense diaphoresis, profound volume depletion, but their core temp remains under 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and their mentation is intact.
But heat stroke?
Heat stroke is a massive red flag. Core temp breaches 104 degrees, causing widespread protein denaturation. The hallmark is an acute change in mentation, confusion, ataxia, seizures.
And classically, absent sweat.
Classically, yes, hot, dry skin. But exertional heat stroke victims may actually still be sweating. So AMS is your reliable indicator.
So for management, cramps and exhaustion get oral electrolyte drinks or IV normal saline, but heat stroke is an absolute medical emergency.
Yes. You prioritize rapid active cooling, ice packs in the axilla and groin, or evaporative misting, and IV normal saline to maintain renal perfusion and mitigate rhabdomyolysis.
Because the necrotic muscle releases myoglobin, right? Now, if they have 104-degree fever, why not just give them Tylenol or ibuprofen?
Do not give them antipyretics. They're completely ineffective here. A febrile illness involves pyrogens resetting the hypothalamic set point, so antipyretics lower that set point.
But environmental heat stroke is different?
It's a mechanical failure of the cooling system. The hypothalamic set point is perfectly normal. Active physical cooling is your only intervention.
But there's a safety boundary, right? You have to stop active cooling once their core temp reaches 101 degrees Fahrenheit.
Or 38.3 degrees Celsius, yes. The body's thermal momentum will keep dropping the temperature. If you aggressively cool them past 101, you'll overshoot and cause iatrogenic hypothermia.
Which perfectly segues into our next segment, cold-related illnesses. The big freeze. If heat stroke is the cooling system failing, hypothermia is what happens when the body is rapidly losing heat through radiation.
All right. Hypothermia is defined as a core temperature dropping below 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius, and it is a cascade of organ failure.
Let's break down the assessment by stages. Mild hypothermia is 95 to 89.6 degrees. That's where you see the aggressive compensatory stuff, right?
Yep. Vigorous shivering, tachycardia, peripheral vasoconstriction, but moderate hypothermia.
That's 89.6 to 82.4 degrees.
This is where the clinical picture deteriorates terrifyingly fast. The shivering reflex abruptly stops, the glycogen stores are depleted, neuromuscular systems fail.
Protective reflexes drop out, including the gag reflex, so the airway is deeply compromised.
And this is where the classic Osborne J-wave manifests on the ECG, signaling delayed ventricular depolarization. By the time they hit severe hypothermia, which is below 82.4 degrees,
they're comatose, renal function shuts down, and they have a profound risk of spontaneous ventricular fibrillation. So if the patient is freezing, shouldn't we just throw them in a hot bath or warm them up as aggressively as possible?
No, that is incredibly dangerous. Management requires intense restraint. If you apply aggressive external heat to a moderately or severely hypothermic patient, you trigger massive peripheral vasodilation.
Shunting all that cold, acidotic, hyperkalemic blood from the extremities straight back to the heart.
It's called core temperature afterdrop. That cold blood hits the highly irritable myocardial tissue, and boom, ventricular fibrillation.
Wow. So rewarming must be gradual.
Exactly. 1 to 2 degrees Celsius per hour using warmed IV fluids and warm humidified oxygen. And gentle handling is a massive safety priority to prevent triggering that VFib.
Plus, we have to watch for metabolic shifts during rewarming.
Right. Because as the blood pH begins to normalize, it causes a rapid intracellular shift of calcium and magnesium. So you need serial ABGs and electrolyte panels to catch those drops before they trigger secondary arrhythmias.
Got it. Now, systemic hypothermia needs slow rewarming, but localized frostbite is the exact opposite.
Yes, because frostbite is basically tissue freezing and osmotic destruction.
Right. Extracellular ice crystals form first, pulling water out of the cells via osmosis, causing profound cellular dehydration.
And then, as the temperature continues dropping, intracellular crystals form. Water expands when it freezes, so these crystals mechanically destroy the cell from the inside out, along with microvascular thrombosis that just cuts off all perfusion.
The text outlines 4 degrees of this. First degree is just erythema and edema, no blisters. Second degree has clear, fluid-filled vesicles. Third degree penetrates the subcutaneous tissue with hemorrhagic blisters.
And fourth degree involves deep muscle and bone, resulting in mummified black Escher.
So how do we manage it? Because unlike hypothermia, we use rapid rewarming here, right?
We do. We submerge the extremity in circulating water, heated precisely between 104 and 108 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 to 30 minutes.
But practically speaking, this process is incredibly painful as the tissue thaws.
Excruciatingly painful. You must administer potent IV opioids. And we also give scheduled ibuprofen.
Just for the pain?
No, specifically for its antiprostaglandin and antithromboxane activity. It halts the localized inflammatory mediators that worsen necrosis. We also use topical aloe vera on clear blisters for the same reason.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And what's the major red flag complication we're monitoring for during recovery?
Compartment syndrome. The massive inflammatory edema can cause the tissue within closed fascial compartments to swell, compress the arterial supply, and cause secondary ischemia.
Which requires an emergent fasciotomy to release the pressure.
Exactly. It's a limb-threatening emergency.
Well, this has been an incredible journey today, from mapping neuroreceptors and barbiturate toxicity to tracking fluid shifts and electrolyte depletion in extreme heat and cold.
It really is foundational stuff.
It is. The core lesson of Chapter 76 is that rapid, accurate clinical reasoning literally saves lives, whether you're in a primary care clinic or the ED. You're not just memorizing symptoms, you are deciphering the exact mechanism of cellular failure.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Consider how narrow the window of human survival truly is.
Yeah.
Just a few degrees of temperature shift or a few milligrams of the wrong chemical can unravel millions of years of evolutionary engineering. As an advanced practice nurse, you are the last line of defense keeping that fragile homeostasis intact. Because our biology is static, but the toxicological environment is evolving exponentially with novel synthetic substances.
That is a profound way to look at it. You are the defense. So keep asking the hard clinical questions, trust your assessments, and on behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you so much for studying with us today. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.